formal qualification can be expensive, time-consuming, and sometimes even not necessary. So how can you advance your professional development without a degree? Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. I came across some numbers that said in Australia, the average student loan is $31,500. One of the things that sometimes saddens me when I'm working with my personal brand coaching clients is the emphasis that professionals who are significantly advanced in their career and on a really impressive trajectory place on going back and getting the education that they may have felt that they didn't get. They want the piece of paper. And what I have found is that a lot of the time this relates to limiting beliefs and a lack of confidence in their professional experience and where they have been able to take their career without the formal qualifications. I say this as someone with 3 formal qualifications, and I was the president of my MBA alumni network. I used to think that formal education was one of the core foundations of your professional experience. But what I have learned over the years is that you don't necessarily always get everything that you need to set you up for your professional development in certain qualifications and certain courses and degrees. For example, when I think about my first day on the job in marketing, after I had done a marketing qualification many years ago now, I actually had to rely on the third-party provider that I was speaking to explain one of the most basic processes to me. It wasn't something that I learned in my 3 years of education. And it makes you wonder if sometimes you can find other ways of learning that are going to be more relevant to industry experience that you will require on the job. Now, of course, this doesn't apply across all industries and all professions, and there certainly are going to be professions that stipulate that having a certain degree or a qualification is a requirement. And sometimes it is a preference for a lot of employers. And of course, it adds to your resume and your career profile. But if you don't necessarily have the funds or the time to be able to have a formal qualification, or it's more related to a limiting belief that you might have for yourself, then consider what your alternative options are. Now, of course, this isn't going to apply if you are wanting to be a neurosurgeon, for example, but in some instances, you can learn the elements that are required in a job through other platforms. So let's dive into what those could be. My tip number 1 is to read daily. There is research that suggests that the average CEO reads 60 books a year. Now, some of these CEOs may have formal qualifications, but it implies that they get a lot of their professional development from books, or they have at least an interest in books, depending on what they might be reading. So when it comes to your own habits, how are you integrating reading into your professional development? I've talked about this a lot in some of my previous episodes, how when I read consistently, as I do, I like to set themes for myself to focus on particular topics. And this gives me a chance to become more skilled and more knowledgeable in really targeted areas. And I make a plan for myself, ideally for the year, as to what those areas are going to be. So how are you integrating daily reading into your routine? Remember that books are often written by industry leaders. They're written by people who have experienced significant success in their field, and they want to pave the way for others still to come. A lot of the time, books can actually also be written by professors from elite universities. This is quite common. It gives you access to their mind and their teaching, even if you don't necessarily ever get into their classroom. And often they are making their quite complex research digestible for the average person and something that you can have key takeaways from really easily. And keep in mind that your books don't actually need to cost you anything. You can join your local library, which is what I do, and I use their ebook service, so I don't actually physically go to the library. And if you do have a little bit of funds that you can allocate to this, in the past I have also used subscription services for reading, which if you aren't familiar with this is almost like the Netflix of books, and there are multiple platforms in that space. My tip number 2 is to tune in to YouTube. There is research in Australia and the US that suggests that the average person watches 2.5 to 3 hours of television per day. Now, if you extend those numbers out across a year, then that would mean that that is the equivalent of 23 to 27 40-hour work weeks. So imagine if you dedicated just a little bit of that time to something that is going to benefit your professional development. I totally understand that feeling of wanting to finish up work and unwind and relax and watch TV. And YouTube is the new TV. In the last year, YouTube recently broke the 10% barrier of TV viewing. It is more and more common for people to sit on the couch and watch TV. It's often said that the first app that 50% of people open on their TV is YouTube. So could you potentially get into the habit of watching at least a video a day in an area that you need to develop your skills in? Maybe it could otherwise be a part of your lunch break. When you add all of these little development opportunities together and you consider the impact of that over a year or over several years, then you are likely going to have significantly built your skills in that area. And like with books, the creators that are on YouTube are often the top in their field in their industry. And books can limit the amount of information that they can convey. They're restricted by page counts and word counts, whereas with their YouTube videos, they can go into often a really minute level of detail that you may not actually get from their books. And they do this over time, so you can get updated information as well that is going to be most relevant to that particular area that you are trying to develop in. Tip number 3 is to enroll in Automobile University. Now, this was one of the pieces of advice from the legendary Zig Ziglar. He challenged you to think about how you could use your commute for more productive activities. There is research that shows that the average commute worldwide is said to be 72 minutes a day. Now, your commute might be longer than that, it might be shorter than that, but when you add all of those numbers up, again, over a year, that can be a significant amount of time that you could dedicate to your professional development, more so than just listening to radio banter that's often quite pointless. And if you enjoy that, then that is absolutely fine. But maybe you could instead switch to a more engaging podcast. Even sometimes podcasts that are more entertainment focused as opposed to educational focused can still give you more information that is going to be relevant in your life than often what a radio segment that you listen to on your way to work or home from work can do. And you might not even want to dedicate that time to really focusing in on something that is related to your professional career. You might use it just to learn about a hobby that you are interested in, or maybe you want to learn a language. But ask yourself, if you strung together all of that time, if there was a better use that you might have for your commute time. Tip number 4 for how you can integrate learning into your daily life is to follow with intention. Now, similar to the TV numbers, research shows that the average person consumes 2.5 hours of social media a day. Now, if you extend that out again, then you're looking at similar numbers, and it equates to the equivalent of nearly half a year in equivalent 40-hour work weeks. So what could you do with that time instead? Now, of course, it is fine, again, like with TV, to enjoy a chance to relax and engage in social media. But when you are doing that, instead of maybe mindlessly scrolling your social media feed, you could make sure that you are following people or businesses or brands that are going to be contributing to the area that you want to be developing in. So are you actually following with intention, or are there accounts that you no longer need to follow, so that your social media feed can start to be curated to be more relevant to the goals that you might have? And if you've watched my channel before, then you would know that this relates to something that I loved from Cal Newport in his book Digital Minimalism, where he talks talks about leveraging technology to benefit your life and your values, as opposed to it essentially being able to take advantage of you and really steal all of your attention. So you're actually optimizing technology for the purpose of pursuing your goals and living your values. And one of the things that he says that I love in the book is that it is a philosophy of technology use in which you focus your online time on a small number of carefully selected and optimized activities that strongly support things you value, and then happily miss out on everything else. My tip number 5 is to turn your passive learning into active learning. Now, the learning pyramid that I have discussed before on this channel is worth remembering. It says that some activities are passive activities and some are active learning activities. Now, reading, for example, is a passive activity, which is why it is important to implement that into more actionable things. So how are you actually actioning the things that you have learned about so you can develop those relevant skills instead of just passively reading about it? It says that retention from reading is 10%. So there is only one thing that sits lower than that in the learning pyramid in terms of retention, and that is lectures. That sits at a 5% retention rate. Now, let's just let that sink in for a minute when you think about what the educational system is primarily based on, and if you could be using your time in better ways. So don't just learn, but actually do. So how are you actually going to be actioning things? Some really practical examples of this could be that you start your own blog, your own YouTube channel, your own podcast, because discussion and actually having to relay other information, like teaching, for example, are the activities that move you up in that retention when it comes to the learning pyramid. So when you actually have to digest that information more, your retention is going to improve. And don't worry if you aren't an expert or you don't consider yourself an expert in a particular field. The point is that you're learning in public and you're inviting other people to learn along with you. If you want to learn more life-changing habits, then check out my previous episode on my top tips for these. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.